Well, in the early 1920s, he came to Havana and he enlisted in the military as a private. And he had been on the railroads prior to that in the early 1920s. And over a period of 10 years, he was in Havana, learned to become a stenographer. This is the period from 1923 to 1933, thereabouts. He had learned to be a stenographer, and as a stenographer, he was assigned to hear take dictation at court trials. And so as the Machado regime, the regime of Gerardo Machado, became more and more brutal in the late 1920s, and a lot of civilian opponents of the regime were tried at military courts. So he overheard that. And the 1920s, the late 1920s, are a time of great conspiracy and great revolutionary upheaval in Cuba. So gradually Batista, in his position as a court stenographer, comes in contact with members of the opposition. All right, and so he becomes a member of an organization called the ABC movement. And that's a movement dedicated to overthrowing Machado. So how he comes onto the public scene is that as the late 20s move on and into the early 30s, the Machado regime grows more and more violent and brutal in terms of its oppression of opponents. At the same time, you have the worldwide economic depression breaking out in October of 1929. When that happens, sugar prices in Cuba plummet. And in addition to the political aspect of the struggle against Machado, you end up having this enormous economic downturn in Cuba. Sugar prices plummet, and so you have great poverty and suffering in Cuba, which exacerbates the political crisis. So as Machado's position in Cuba deteriorates, the United States government, and specifically the Roosevelt administration, decides that it needs to find a way to get Machado to leave. That's in the best interest. Under Roosevelt, there was instituted a new policy called the Good Neighbor policy. And so that took away, to some extent, the possibility of a direct intervention in Cuba, direct military intervention. So what happens is that Franklin Roosevelt sends over a diplomat with whom he has very close personal ties, a man named Sumner Welles. Sumner Welles is this very odd, strange character by Cuban standards. He's a tall man, very thin, quite dapper, always very carefully dressed and so forth. Anyway, he starts negotiating the terms of Machado's departure. All right, and like Batista will do in 1959, Machado leaves on August 12th, 1933, rather suddenly. His government, the military, it's clear, starts turning on him, and there's a general strike that breaks out in early August of 1933. He sees his position collapsing. He realizes that he himself is quite likely to become a victim if he doesn't get out. So he flees to the Bahamas. That leaves this enormous turmoil in Cuba. And there's a whole revolutionary vengeance is carried out in the streets of Cuba on a grand scale. And it leaves the military in tatters. The organizational structure of the military is totally in ruins because one of the main supporters of Machado had been the military. So as I mentioned to you earlier, Batista had been working in the Machado opposition in a relatively small, modest fashion. He had been giving reports to about different trials where he was a stenographer to a clandestine radio station. And as I say, there was also a faction within the military among the enlisted men that was against Machado. So when Machado flees, there's this great turmoil in Cuba, and everyone is attacking the military, blaming the military for the years of Machado's brutality. And so within the military, there becomes a debate. Who is going to be blamed for Machado's dictatorship and prolonging Machado's time in power? Is it going to be the officers, you know, or the junior officers, the senior officers, or the enlisted men? All right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a time of great economic depression in Cuba in this period. And so a lot of the enlisted men feel that they're going to be blamed for prolonging Machado, and that's going to be used as a justification for, one, cutting their salaries, and two, for reducing the size of the army. All right, so they're afraid they're going to lose their positions. All right, Batista is one of the leaders, along with another man named Pablo Rodriguez, of a group within the enlisted men who's very concerned about this. As the chaos breaks out, they see an opportunity to take control of the army. They're afraid the junior officers are going to purge them, so they figure they'll strike first and eliminate their enemies in terms of the junior officers in the military. So they start off not to topple the government that followed Machado. The government that followed Machado took power on August 12th, 1933. Machado fled, and this government, which was seen as very closely tied to the United States, led by a man named Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, Céspedes being the son of, the padre de la patria, who had fought in the 19th century against the Spanish. Céspedes, who's very close to the U.S. State Department, he comes to power August 12, 1933. He's also seen as very tied in to the U.S. Ambassador Sumner Welles. All right, so it's not seen as by many people in the public as a real revolutionary counterpoint to what had existed under Machado. He's seen as a puppet. All right, so as I say, Batista and his group, his small group of conspirators, are not initially concerned about toppling Céspedes. They don't have a political program per se, but they are concerned, as I say, that the junior officers are going to remove them, reduce their salaries, and so forth. So on September 4th of 33, they hold this meeting in Camp Columbia, which is the center of military power in Cuba, right outside of Havana. And they decide that they're going to take control of the armed forces. And as events progress that day, they realize that once they remove the officers, they're also going to have to remove the government. Because if the officers return to power, they're going to end up, they fear, before a firing squad. So on September 4th of 33, early in the morning, they have this meeting, and throughout the day, as it progresses, they decide to take over all the military installations in Cuba. They do this by telephone, telegraph, and they had conspirators sprinkled throughout the island. Now, the problem they face, as I say, is that having taken this initial step, they have to go further, because their position becomes really dangerous if the officers return. But they don't have a political program. So part of what they do is in the evening of September 4th, 33, they reach out for allies. And one of Batista's companions, friends of this period, had been a journalist by the name of Sergio Carbó. And Carbó has ties to the university students and the student directory, which had opposed Machado. So Carbó makes the link between the enlisted men and the student directory. The student directory comes on to Camp Columbia, and they begin to advise Batista and the other enlisted men about how to form a government, which they do in the early morning hours of September 5th of 1933.
Now, I just want to stop right there for a second. I want to ask you, Batista, is he reacting to these circumstances, or did he have aspirations from the beginning of being the leader of Cuba? Did he have a particular motivation?
Well, you know, I don't know. I don't think he did. My reading of it, of course, that's a question that one can never know with absolute certainty. I mean, he had been a child of abject poverty. He had grown up in a hut with a dirt floor, a one-room home. So he comes from abject poverty. He finished his education in the 3rd or 4th grade, his formal education. But Batista, one thing, as I did my biography of him, I noticed he had a tremendous hunger for knowledge, a tremendous hunger for doing something more for himself. When he worked on the railroad, after he left Banes, where he was born at the age of 14, he consumed much of his time reading everything he could get his hands on. And so in the late 1910s, 1918, 1919, when he was working on the railroad, instead of rabble-rousing, going out a lot to party, he often would be found in his room, his office, his apartment, reading a book. And that was one of the main observations they made about him. So he clearly had this innate intelligence that always had him thinking about how to move ahead. And no one in 1933 could have possibly predicted that this fellow with a 4th grade education, mixed race ancestry, a child of abject poverty, would possibly have had such an important role in Cuban politics for the next 25 years. It would have been impossible to predict that. So I don't think, to answer, get back to a direct answer of your question, I don't think that when he starts off on September 4th of 33, he has a sense that he's going to end up ruling Cuba. I think he wants to address inequities within the armed forces. There was tremendous prejudice against the enlisted men by the officers. I mentioned it in my book that sometimes when an officer would come into a room where an enlisted man was, the enlisted officer was supposed to remain silent or even leave. The dining hall, the sergeants, for example, which is what Batista was, the military dining halls in Cuba, the tables reserved for the sergeants wouldn't have tablecloths on them. So you see this little stratification, this class system within the military that really grates on him. And you also have the officers tend to be middle class or wealthy, tend to be Cubans of European descent, whereas the enlisted officers tend to be less wealthy and of more mixed race groups. So I think that when he takes control on September 4th of 33, his intentions start off smaller. Not that removing the officers is really a small thing, but I don't think he anticipates taking over the entire government of Cuba and removing the president. But as things evolve, he sees that he has no choice. He brings in this group of students to help him form a government, and then he himself becomes the military chief of staff.
And then at one point he wanted to get some leave to see a dying relative. Tell me about that.
Well, I think in trying to put together a clear picture of why, besides the issues I already mentioned about the class and racial issues within the Army, I think in trying to understand him personally and why he would be anti the government, there's a story which is kind of sad and sort of gives you an indication of the corruption within the Army in the early 30s. His father comes down with an illness, I believe it's 1931, and he requests leave to go see him. His father is dying in eastern Cuba, all the way in a town called Banes, near Holguin. And he is in Havana, he's stationed in Havana, and he wants to get pay. You know, the provisions of the military allowed them to get a certain amount of money to get a train to go see their relatives on such occasions. They delay the issuance of his money, he can't go by the time, and then when they finally give him the money, it's less than he was entitled to, which goes to the issue of corruption. Obviously someone else got that money. And by the time he gets there, his father's died and been buried. All right, so the Batista family gave me some excerpts from his diary at the time, and they indicate a sense of bitterness, as you can imagine, and from that incident. So I don't think it goes, I'm stretching things too far to think that has another plays a role in his dissatisfaction with the military hierarchy and contributes to his joining a military conspiracy 2 years after his father died.
So it's just one more factor in a growing list of reasons.
Things that propel him in the direction that he ends up going. Well, I think the interesting thing about looking at Batista was that our interpretation historically had been frozen in time. When people think about Batista, they think of the dictator from the 1950s. But the Batista of the 30s is a very different creature. He actually emerges from the political left within Cuba. He has a claim to a revolutionary background there, because he enters the revolution of 1933 as the leader of the military, and he brings about a desegregation to a large extent of the military. So you end up having greater upward mobility for Afro-Cubans and less wealthy Cubans within the military. And that's one of the things that really antagonizes the old officer corps. So when he tries to get them to return, they don't. They hold themselves up in the Hotel Nacional, and they end up in a shooting match where ultimately Batista sends in the tanks there to remove them from the hotel, bringing about the end of the conflict with the officers for the most part. So, as I say, he enters the political arena coming from a revolutionary perspective and coming from the left. He rules Cuba essentially from 1934 onward, after the revolutionary government that takes power in September of 33 collapses in January of 34. He'll end up ruling Cuba from behind a series of presidents. He does this purposely because he doesn't want to become the subject of or the focus of all political and personal attacks occurring in Cuba. So he takes that on. He also doesn't want to be viewed as a dictator. All right, so he enters into a power-sharing arrangement with civilian politicians. As events deteriorate in Cuba throughout the 1930s and labor strife intensifies, he ends up gaining more and more power. And the civilian politicians end up having to give him more and more power. And he takes it too. I don't want to make it sound, but what I'm trying to tell you is that it's a complex dynamic between civilian and military forces there. And so he does, by no means does he have absolute power in this relationship. He has the predominant amount of power, but he's not operating in a vacuum, ruling over everything. So what he does throughout the 30s is he rules behind a civilian facade. And the worse the situation gets, probably reaching the pinnacle in March of 35, when there is a nationwide strike in Cuba, perhaps probably the largest strike in Cuban history. When you think about the fact that the population of Cuba at the time is about 4 million people or so, thereabouts, 4 to 5 million people, and when you consider the fact that 500 to 600,000 people are on strike, you get a sense of the enormity of that strike. It paralyzes the government and it forces him out into the open, really. as clearly the person behind the power structure in Cuba. What he does is somewhere about in terms of my review of the historical records and the archives, the first time he mentions an interest in becoming president himself, and becoming the clear leader of Cuba as opposed to ruling from the military and in the background, is in 1935. Somewhere in the time of this strike, he starts, or perhaps immediately afterwards, he starts letting the U.S. State Department know that he's interested in that. And he does it in a sort of an offhanded way, but you can see he's starting to plant the seeds. And so from that point on, somewhere in the early or middle of 1935, I think it's clear from the historical record that he's considering it. All right, and as a result, you see what he starts to do from that point on is he starts to build an agenda, an issues-based agenda, for which that he can use to run on later on. That he can actually, when democracy is established in Cuba, when there are elections, he essentially starts building a political platform and a series of accomplishments. And so what he does is his agenda, his political agenda, starts focusing in on rural education. That becomes an area that he starts to focus on. And given his background as a poor country boy, that makes a lot of sense. And there were areas of Cuba, because Cuba is an enormous island. It's something like 700 miles long, and there are some areas of it that are very lightly populated and very isolated. And so many areas of rural Cuba had no schools. So what he does in late 35, early 36 is he unveils this rural education program. All right, and the goal is to build thousands of schools in rural Cuba. All right, and as they start to do that, they realize that that's not going to be a sufficient enough way of dealing with rural education, because it's not so much just to build a school, which they end up building over the course from 1936 to 1940. They build about 1,100 rural schools. All right, and they use the military to do it. They use these specially trained sergeants who go out into the countryside, and they are charged with building a school and then getting the children who have not traditionally gone to school to come to it. All right, and so sergeants are dispatched after a few months of training into the countryside, and their goal is to build a school. But what they quickly realize is that there are other issues there besides putting a school, like there's intestinal parasites that are of great harm to the children, and many children are greatly die. Some children even die from it. So they realize that they also need to create a traveling medical facilities to visit these schools. And then the same issue also goes with in terms of planting and the best use of the soil. Many of the techniques being used in the countryside are not beneficial in terms of maximum production of the soil. All right, so as they enter into the arena of rural education, they start having to establish all sorts of ancillary programs to support the rural schools. All right, yes?
No, and the 1,100 schools you mentioned, those are actually schools that got built, not that they were planned.
Right. The Batista government at some point exaggerates the number of schools. If you look at some of their documents, they'll tell you they built something like 2,000. But the best historical data I could find indicates it's about 1,100 schools.
That's not bad, because the state of New Jersey in 2006 can't get 300 schools built.
Well, right. It's an enormous achievement. It's an enormous achievement.
I also want to ask you about the area of healthcare. What happened with his brother and his inability to get access, and how did that motivate him to improve healthcare?
Right. Well, as part of this reform agenda that he has in mind, that he starts developing after 35, he had been greatly impacted when in the 1920s, I don't recall, I think it's 24, 25, his brother comes down with tuberculosis. And it's a very traumatic thing for him, because what happens is his brother comes from the countryside to live with him in Havana. His brother is only 2 years younger than him. So when his brother comes, he's a man, right in the prime of his life, in his early 20s, and he's terribly ill. And one of the things I learned from my research project was the unbelievable pain and agony of suffering through tuberculosis in that time, because it scars the lung tissue, eventually making it impossible for you to breathe. And so in the latter days of the latter stages of the disease, you're literally coughing up blood. And so his brother comes to live with him. They realize that, and he takes a great risk by having his brother come to live with him, because his wife is pregnant and tuberculosis is an infectious disease. So in any case, they go around and they can't find a place for him to go. Finally, they put him in a facility which is little better than a warehouse. All right, and so over the course of 18 months or so, he watches his brother, his health deteriorate over time, and he's reminded of his late mother, and he had a special feeling, a sense of obligation that he wanted to save his brother. He happened to be visiting on the day when his brother died, and ends up dying in his arms, spitting up blood all over Batista. So, when you read speeches by Batista, it's one of the few times, you really get a sense of emotion and great sadness in his speeches. And so as a result of his death, part of the rural education program also becomes establishing these tuberculosis clinics throughout the island. And one of his dreams also is to create a state-of-the-art tuberculosis sanatorium in the Escambray, in an area called Topes de Collantes. And so he actually travels through the area in that period looking for a site. And in fact, they end up building a state-of-the-art tuberculosis sanatorium. So he made it one of his agenda items to try to help tuberculosis patients throughout the island and establish state-of-the-art facilities for them.
Did medical care in general improve as well under him? Was that a topic? And well, go ahead.
Well, I think that it's an area that has been not studied enough. What's happened is that most of the scholarship done on Cuba either centers on the independence wars or the period of the late 19th century or the period after the Cuban Revolution took power from 59 onward. So I found the subject little studied. And I make that point in my book that this is an area that scholars need to look at. We need to get better data on it. People have, the work that has been done has tended to minimize the success of the program. But I think that we can't make a definitive statement about its impact. But there were clinics established throughout the island, and ultimately this sanatorium gets built, although it becomes a political power struggle between Batista and his enemies, who will take power in 44 when Batista's handpicked successor loses the election. So this sanatorium that Batista had built there becomes a political issue, and it doesn't get utilized to the extent that it should be.
Does Batista ever actually get elected to office legitimately?
He does. He gets elected in 1940, after ruling behind a civilian facade, he, with great pressure from the United States, and also World War II is breaking out in Europe, and there's a great sense that in the Western Hemisphere that these dictatorships need to be moving towards democracy. And so as a result, Batista also astutely judging the climate of Cuba and knowing, learning the lessons of Machado, which unfortunately he then falls, he doesn't heed his own advice, his own historical legacy in the 50s. He ends up staying in power too long. But in the 30s, judging the character of Cuba and the state of the national affairs, he makes a decision to promote a constitutional convention, which they have in 1939. The Constitution of 1940, paves the way for democratic elections in 1940. Now, Batista runs in the 40 elections against his old adversary, the university professor Ramon Grau San Martin. All right, and Batista has enormous advantages going into that election. He has a big campaign fund. He had essentially been controlling the mechanisms of power for the last 7-8 years beforehand. So he's uniquely poised there to win that election. There is some political, I should say military interference in some of the outlying provinces, all right, that some people credit with tipping the election to Batista, or helping tip it. I myself question that because the victory is pretty overwhelming for Batista. He wins it very solidly.
So the fact that he actually wins a democratic election in 1940, does that indicate, obviously an indication of his popularity? The average Cuban must have benefited from his policies. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would say that it's not so much a testament to his popularity. He's an incredibly astute politician, and there are a couple of things he does. As I mentioned, he has an enormous financial advantage over Grau San Martin and the Auténticos, who are his principal opponents. He has all the levers of power, and he uses them during the election campaign. He also, one of the clear things that the last of the presidents behind which he ruled, Federico Laredo Bru, one of the things he negotiates as part of the terms of the election of 1940 and how it'll be conducted is that you can't split your vote. I'm going into a little bit of a technical issue here, but it's important to understand why Batista wins. Batista is the candidate for like 5 or 6 parties, including the Communist Party. And the way that the election law is structured in 1940, you can't split your vote. So if you want to vote for the candidates in your party, you have to vote for Batista. You can't say, okay, I'll vote for my candidates and then I'll go and vote for Grau San Martin. Okay, so Batista is the candidate for 6 political parties, and that gives him also an advantage. So, so I think he certainly has a core base of support. I would never say that he was a popular, well-loved political figure amongst the masses, if you will, in Cuba. But I would say he had a solid political support, and he used all of the political levers of power to his advantage in the 40 election to secure his election. He's sworn in October of 1940. And the beginning of his administration is not exactly without incident. In February of 41, his right-hand man, José Pedraza, will try to remove him from power. So that's the first of many political challenges that he's going to face. And he ends up having to put down that revolt. And then he ends up trying a unity government, all right? Because of World War II, which is now breaking out, he forms a unity government. There's a lot of quarreling, there's a lot of bickering in his administration. One of his accomplishments is that he is able to gain some economic concessions from the United States. So they're willing to make certain public works improvements, build and improve certain airport facilities because the United States wants to use them for its war effort. And so in that sense, he gains some economic concessions from the United States. He also negotiates a deal where the entire sugar crop, or almost the entire sugar crop, goes to the United States for the Allied war effort. They can't get sugar from the Far East at this time, or very many other locations, so he ends up benefiting that way, as many other countries of Latin America do. And so what he ends up doing is then he takes this money and reinvests it in the Cuban economy. So it's a good period economically for Cuba. In terms of public policy issues, I wouldn't say it's a tremendously successful period. He comes under ferocious criticism. The Congress at one point is controlled by his enemies, so they they prevent a lot of things from moving forward. But overall, he also reaches a settlement, or he's working well with the union, so it's a time of prosperity, and the unions are doing very well. So workers are gaining benefits. So those are just some of the issues that he's dealing with. The issue comes up about whether or not Cuba should join in World War II and actually send some soldiers. That's never resolved. They ultimately don't.
What was the relationship of Batista with the United States in general and the Roosevelt administration in particular? I mean, he was welcomed at the White House at least one time that I've seen. So what was the relationship?
Yeah, he visited twice. He visited the White House twice. One as military commander in November of 1938, and then again in the 1940s, he visited Roosevelt as head of state.
Cuba's president arrives in Washington. A military guard of honor salutes the one-time Army sergeant who now holds his country's highest office. Fulgencio Batista, welcome to the Capitol. President Roosevelt waits to greet him. Staunch exponent of America's good neighbor policy, President Batista was one of the first to follow the United States in war upon the Axis. He meets Vice President Wallace and the cabinet, and he's off to inspect United States war plans.
He had a very contentious relationship with the United States in the 30s. Again, going back to the question or the issue I was raising with you before, often Batista is viewed as someone in the pocket of the United States. And he's viewed as having a very, very close relationship in the 1950s. But the Batista of the 30s and 40s has a somewhat contentious relationship. In the 33 revolution, he removes a government that's sympathetic to the United States. And for the first few months, the United States is trying to remove Batista from power through its ambassador, Sumner Welles. Excuse me. Later on, particularly in the campaign of 1940, he really attacks the United States and goes after issues like United States economic domination of Cuba and exploitation of Cuba. He harps on that quite a bit in the 1940 campaign. And also, he's allied with the Communist Party, something which creates enormous distrust for him in US government circles. So it's a contentious relationship. He's trying, in this context of being, a country that relies on the United States in terms of its sugar exports, he's trying to carve out an independent political sphere for Cuba, one that is, less reliant on the United States.
What was the Platt Amendment, and what role did Batista play in getting rid of it?
Well, the Platt Amendment was forced on the Cubans in 1901 during their constitutional convention prior to gaining independence from the United States, because, as you know, the United States intervenes in the Cuban Independence War, and that launches the Spanish-Cuban-American War. The United States defeats the Spanish, and so one of the bitterest moments in Cuban history is the fact that instead of gaining outright independence from Spain, they become a colony of the United States until 1902, from 1898 to 1902. So one of the things that the Cuban leaders, political leaders at the time, had made very clear is that they did not want to become a state of the United States. And they gradually, the United States moves towards giving Cuba its independence. But what they do is, rather than give it full independence, they give it sort of this crippled, sort of mediated sovereignty. And they do that by forcing the Cubans to accept what's called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment allowed the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever its economic or political interests were at risk. Okay, so that becomes a real sore point. Even in that heated debate of 1901, the insertion of the Platt Amendment and the agreement to a treaty with the United States passes by only one vote. And so that ends up becoming one of the darkest episodes in the relationship between the United States and Cuba, and one that the Cuban Revolution continues to bring up. So in terms of Batista's role, there had been an effort throughout Cuban history. The 20th century, in a sense, of Cuban history, you can see as one constant struggle to try to define the Cuban nation apart from the United States. And so what we see is, something that's obviously the main theme of the Cuban Revolution, is really something you can find embedded throughout the 20th century of Cuban history. And so the Platt Amendment is something that administration after administration in Cuba is trying to negotiate a way to remove that, to end that relationship with the United States as signified by the Platt Amendment. And so finally, throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, Washington is coming to an understanding that the way it had been dealing with Latin America through military intervention was just a failed policy. And that's one of the things that motivates Roosevelt to move towards the good neighbor policy. The Revolution of '33 takes a quick anti-American turn, because any uprising against the government inevitably would turn anti-American, because the United States was seen as always supporting any administration that was good for its economic interests, whether the administration was good or bad for the Cubans in general. So once the Revolution of '33 takes power, they immediately declare an end to the Platt Amendment. And so Batista is part of that group that takes power, as I mentioned earlier, on September 4th of '33. And it's that revolutionary junta led by President Ramon Grau San Martin, that will eliminate the Platt Amendment. They'll say, we're not accepting it anymore, all right? The U.S., of course, doesn't accept the unilateral negation of the Platt Amendment by the revolutionary government, but it's clear that the revolutionary government is not going back in that regard. So just by way of finalizing it, it formally comes off the table. The United States formally recognizes the Platt Amendment is dead in May of '34, but the revolutionary government pretty much put a nail in that coffin.
Okay, Moving on to 44, Batista willingly steps aside and allows a legitimate election. What happens there?
Well, it's interesting because as I was looking at the records of the U.S. ambassador to Cuba at the time, a man named Spruill Braden, there at Columbia University, and I kept reading in his records that he's absolutely sure that Batista will not allow this to be an honest election, and he's absolutely sure that Batista will either force the election of his hand-picked successor, because just to clarify, the 1940 Constitution did not allow anyone to seek re-election. So once his term ended in 1944, Batista could not be a candidate. So he had appointed someone or worked with somebody by the name of Carlos Saladrigas to be to carry on the government's banner, to carry on his work. And so the U.S., many people in the U.S. were skeptical that he would not allow it to be a clean election. And in fact, his candidate lost the election in really one of the cleanest elections in Cuban history. And in fact, Batista does oversee a peaceful transition of power.
Ramon Grau San Martin, President-elect of Cuba, arrives in Washington for conferences with President Roosevelt, met by the Cuban ambassador to the United States. Dr. Grau, scholar as well as national leader, was formerly a professor at Havana University. Secretary of State Cordell Hull extends an official welcome to the Cuban president-elect, whose visit symbolizes the close ties between Cuba and the United States. Another distinguished guest is Dr. Wellington Koo, China's ambassador to Great Britain, who will represent China in allied post-war security conferences at Dumbarton Oaks, Washington.
Yeah, the 40s, unlike the 30s, you know, Batista had periodically used censorship, and there had been bouts of brutality in the 30s, you know, to repress revolutionary groups that were trying to topple the government. But in the 40s, once the Constitution is put into place and Batista's president, you have this enormous, you know, political openness. And so Batista's very much, you know, ridiculed by his opponents, praised by those who follow him. And so there is a sense of political openness. And the 40s, particularly the early and mid 40s, are a great period of, they're a good economic period in Cuba because the entire sugar crop is bought by the United States. And so it gives a level of security that was not typical. And it allows the Cubans to develop other industries and so forth.
Where does Batista go between 44 and where does he go and what does he do between 44 and the coup of 52?
Well, what happens is after his whole life changes after the presidential transfer. He divorces his first wife. He moves he marries his second wife in New York City. They live for a time at the Waldorf Astoria. He then moves, buys a home in Daytona Beach, Florida. And they live there from 45 to 1947. And I went down to Daytona Beach, interviewed a number of the relatives of the time, and Batista, you know, frequently received political followers and those who wanted him to get back into politics there at his Daytona Beach home. But he used it as a time, I think, to change his life. He had divorced his first wife, had married Marta Fernandez. They had already, before they got married, they had had a child. He had had this relationship with her for many years quietly and had her in a home in Havana while he was president of Cuba. So once he loses the election, he takes the opportunity to change his personal life, and then he moves to Daytona Beach. throughout the beginning of the Grau administration, which goes from 1944 to 1948, they're early on, once Grau takes over, it's still Batista's military that he's ruling over. All right, and so there are a couple of early attempts to try to launch conspiracies against Grau. Batista receives some of these conspirators in Daytona Beach, urges them to not proceed with any sort of uprisings. The thing is that Batista, we'd be writing a very different story about him if his career ends in 1944 or 45, because he actually does a little traveling throughout Latin America, and he's hailed as a democratic leader, a revolutionary who had become a democratic leader, and then his candidate lost the election, and he allowed that smooth transition. So he's viewed in this period with a great deal of credibility, even though he has enormous detractors, his military background, he's unappealing to some, but he's a person with genuine credentials, in the Democratic camp. The coup of '52 really ruins his legacy, I think, looking at it from a historian's perspective, because, as I say, he started off with revolutionary credentials, had taken some reform measures like rural education and land reform and so forth, and had helped contributed to the Constitution of 1940 and a democratic system and institutions in Cuba. And then when his candidate lost, he allowed that to happen. All right, but the coup of '52 kind of ruins his legacy. Well, there's enormous upheaval, enormous corruption in the two governments that follow Batista, the presidency of Ramon Grau San Martin and the president of Carlos Prio Socarrás, the presidency of Socarrás. And so you have one enormous scandal after another. One of the main political candidates of the period is a man named Eduardo Chiva. And he ends up shooting himself during one of his radio programs in August of 1951 at the conclusion of it, and ends up dying. This creates an enormous upheaval in Cuba. The democratic institutions established by the Constitution of 1940 are denigrated, and by the corruption, Chivas's death, and there's a sense that the Cuban democracy is not working. Batista is approached by conspirators, and it's clear, I've looked over some of the polling data, he decides to run. I should preface this by saying he decides to run in the elections of 1952. All right, it's clear from the polling data that he's not going to win. Usually comes up in second place. All right, he's approached by conspirators within the military. He creates this artifice that there's some of the supporters of Carlos Prio Socarrás are going to launch a coup. So as a result, he uses that and the rampant corruption in Cuba as his excuse to topple the government. And he does that on March 10th, 1952.
Cuba once again experiences a revolution. The regime of President Carlos Prio Socarrás is ended by a combined group of younger elements of the Army, Navy, and Police, headed by former President Fulgencio Batista. The revolution, kicked off at 2:43 in the morning, lasted little more than an hour. In another coup staged in 1933, Batista started a rule of disciplined democracy, which lasted for 11 years. This time, the overthrow of the government is almost bloodless. 2 palace guards were slain, and shortly after, deposed President Prio and members of his cabinet took off by plane for Mexico. The former sergeant, now General Fulgencio Batista, comes to Camp Columbia, Cuba's key army base, with his supporters to address his troops and present his case to his countrymen. Batista said he had lost confidence in the Prio government and intends to maintain law and order as a friend of the people until a free election.
He works with remnants that are still supporting him in the military, and some other civilian conspirators, and he removes Prio Socarrás, who then flees into exile in Miami.
Again, very briefly, why was he able to do that so easily? I mean, it really, I think one person died, was it, in the coup?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Prio was unwilling to fight, and it's one of the startling things if you look at the photos from the period of Bohemia. As Prio is leaving the country, he looks like he's going to a social gathering. He's so finely dressed, and clearly he had no stomach for working with his own supporters. There were those in the military, not many, but a few willing to back him, but he just decided to leave. You're right, there was absolutely next to no opposition to the coup within Cuba because the Prio regime was so corrupt and the political institutions were so debased by this spiraling corruption that no one fought to preserve the Prio Socarrás government. And he still had supporters within the military, and they turned to him because they thought he was the person that could restore order, tranquility, stability to a Cuba that seemed to be spiraling out of control. And so he decides he's going to make his move, and he decides he's going to do that. A little story I can tell you from his brother-in-law, Roberto Fernandez Miranda, who ends up becoming the chief of his personal security. He was telling me a story when I interviewed him that Batista had doubts about the coup of '52, even a day or two before. He had been watching Cuban television, and they were debating, there were these rumors that Batista was going to get involved and was in fact going to topple the government. And one of the journalists said, no, Batista would never do that. He's got this great reputation as a democratic leader, and this would ruin it, so he wouldn't do that. And so Batista and Roberto Fernandez Miranda are watching this show, and he's commenting on that. And according to Fernandez Miranda, he started to have doubts about it. But at that point, it was a day or two before the coup, and there was no turning back. Well, I think that the problem with the Batista government throughout the 1950s is it has no legitimacy. It cannot claim legitimacy, and the contradictions within Batista's career are so obvious here that not even he can paper over them. The issue is that he himself had worked throughout the 1930s to lead up to the Constitutional Convention of 39 and 40. So he's a key person in establishing the democratic institutions that were established in the 40s. And as we mentioned earlier, he's the first elected president under those new rules. So when he launches the coup in '52, in a sense, he's wiping away, he's at war with his own legacy at that point. He's at war with his own earlier declared principles. And so he really cannot get out of that bind. The other thing, too, is he tries to argue that it's a revolution, and in fact, it's not. It's clearly a cynical grab for power. And the other thing about it is that he cannot find, he says early on, right after the coup, that he's just going to be a short-term transitional figure until the Cuban situation in Cuba can be stabilized, and then he'll be moving on. Well, that short-term transition ends up lasting 7 years almost. So that's his biggest problem. He's essentially at war with his own legacy. And while no one fought to defend Prio Socarrás and that government, no one expected Batista to still be in power 6 years after the coup. And then he ends up trying to set up a series of elections which no one has much faith in because they don't include revolutionary factions within the society. So in '54, he has a presidential election, where he essentially runs unopposed. All right, so that election becomes, a cynical sort of thing. And then in '58, a similar thing. You end up having an election which most of the parties in Cuba don't take part in. So he's totally unsuccessful, having taken power on March 10th, '52, under these circumstances of negotiating his own departure from power. He keeps relying on the fact that he is the person that can hold it together. He's the person that is crucial for a transition back to democracy in Cuba, when he in fact ultimately becomes the biggest obstacle to going back to democracy. There's no doubt about it, and I mentioned it in the earlier periods. The typical pattern under Batista is when his government is under enormous stress, his political opponents end up dead in parking lots or in parks, shot through the head. So that's a pattern. I found no evidence that he himself personally called for these things, but he certainly tolerated it. And you see example after example after example. I think morally you can judge that to be not much different between directly calling for those assassinations and tolerating them. There's, I think, a very thin line of difference between those two. That's what Batista always said, that he had no direct involvement in those things. But yes, it is a regime that relies to some extent on brutality. And like in the Moncada attack, most of the people who are captured after the attack of 20th of July 1953, they don't die in battle. They die as a result of torture afterwards. So as a result, it gives a powerful weapon to revolutionaries to bring up that very issue of brutality.
They not only were killed afterwards, right? Some of them were castrated and...
Yes, I mean, they were tortured. Yeah, they were tortured and then, were killed.
I have somebody who I know really well in Union City who used to live in the same neighborhood as one of Batista's former army men, and he said that something that they used to do was something called Dale Betum, which is that they used to stick someone's head under a Jeep and run it over so that they wouldn't be recognized. Did you ever hear about that?
No, but no, I didn't. I have not heard that specific thing, but there certainly are a number of cases, numerous cases of that.
Now, the economy was a relatively good economy during those years. For the average, for the middle, there was a pretty significant middle class in Cuba.
Right. I mean, if you were to look at the all of the criteria for development and so forth, you would see that Cuba was on the high end of most of those barometers in terms of Latin American development and so forth. In terms of literacy and in terms of per capita income, you would find that Cuba was among the highest in Latin America. And that's when you read Batista wrote a series of books after he was forced from power. And that's the rationale he uses to explain his term in power and to justify it. He'll argue about this enormous number of public works projects that are undertaken during his tenure in power, like the Plaza de la Revolución, from which Castro always gives his speeches, and there's a big monument to José Martí that's actually completed under Batista's term in power. So he gives you these enormous, throughout all of his books, these enormous statistical explanations for why his government was good for Cuba. The only problem is that the Cubans were not accepting of that rationale.
People who went up to the Cambrai, Mato, all have commented how surprisingly easy it was to oust Batista. I think the general public thinks that it was this like World War II-like situation. They've all commented that really he lost support of the military. They weren't fighting. Is that your opinion?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it. He had an army of about 20,000 men. They had good equipment. If they had fought, it's hard to see how they would have lost to the small group of rebels in the Sierra Maestra, and then, you know, ultimately the group in the Escambray also contributed to that. But yeah, so you're right. I think the army decided not, at some point, it wasn't going to fight for Batista. He was discredited. And there's a number of reasons for that, if you'd like me to go into those.
Give me... Yeah.
Well, as I say, he doesn't have legitimacy. And I think Cuba's a revolutionary society. It always had been. It was a society deeply steeped in its own history. It understood the sacrifices of generations of the past, the enormous number of people that were killed in struggles for independence throughout the 20th century. And as a result, it didn't have much allegiance to Batista. He could not justify his ongoing power. So.
Was the final nail in his coffin the U.S. withdrawing support to him? And if so, tell me about that.
Well, I don't know if there were any one final nail. You know, I find that, I'm not sure I could say it that way. I think he had certain structural problems with his regime. One, as I said, is the lack of legitimacy that he had. He could not explain nor justify how he could completely betray his own earlier career, number one. Number two, obviously Castro was an ingenious manipulator of images. The fact that he's able to emerge alive in the Sierra Maestra in 1957 after after Batista had said he was dead, certainly was a public relations black eye for Batista. And then gradually, the struggle in the cities began to have an impact on Batista. The bombs going off in different cities, particularly Santiago, also in Havana, that started to create doubts about what already most people thought was an illegitimate government. And then I think the brutality backfired on him. I mean, I think, sometimes in warfare, numbers get exaggerated. So I think the Castro government has often said there were 10,000 martyrs, so to speak. I think the number's nowhere near that. But I think it's more in the realm of 700 or 800 or so throughout the 1950s, which is high enough. But I think that is also a message of terror that backfires on him. That terrorizing his own population undermines the support. And then I think the fact is that the middle class and the wealthy also abandoned Batista. That had been his traditional backbone of power, particularly in the middle class. And once because in the 30s and 40s, they view Batista as a facilitator of order. And so they back him, even though there are some things about his government that they don't like. But in the 50s, with this overt reign of terror, with the United States gradually, support within the United States gradually eroding, with this public image of Castro as this flamboyant, youthful revolutionary, all of these things eventually start to move the middle class away from Batista. So I think all of those issues contribute to the downfall. Certainly the U.S., by not, and the Eisenhower administration, by refusing to send replacement parts for the Cuban army, and rifles. I believe they had purchased several thousand rifles, and they start to refuse to transport them to Cuba. I think that sends a message that, support for Batista's light. It's weak.
And I think that's something very important that you just mentioned, is that I think the American public thinks that it was a war of peasants against Batista. It wasn't, right? It was a war of students and middle and upper class that were the ones who were able to bring about that.
That would be right. I mean, Castro in the Sierra campaign does bring in a certain number of the rural peasantry in Cuba into the mix, and they certainly supply food and logistical assistance to the rebels in the Sierra. So they play a role, but you're right, the focus of the revolutionary struggle is not in the peasantry per se. They support the Sierra campaign, but most of the fighters with Castro are not rural campesinos, guajiros. They're mostly, from the cities that have gone to the Sierra to fight with him. They're middle class, they're intellectuals, and the urban campaign likewise. It's those who become disenfranchised from Batista and the way the government is going, the brutality, and they wage a campaign of urban violence.
Batista and Castro, they had a meeting?
They did meet on one occasion, supposedly introduced by Rafael Diaz-Balart, who had been a member of the youth movement for Batista. Introduces them at Batista's finca, and supposedly, I don't know, I haven't finished my research on this aspect of it yet, but supposedly from the stories I've heard, Castro pulls out one of the books in Batista's collection, and it has to do with something about being a dictator or something, and the uses of power, and he starts joking about how Batista should be utilizing it and so forth. And they have a very brief exchange about this. This is before, of course, Moncada and the attack in Moncada.
But you know something, I forget where I read that there really is no clear, definitive record that you could say, yeah, this is true from either side of what happened in that meeting. Right? Because I know you're doing your book in two parts.
Right. Well, I haven't, of course, one of the things in history that we always have to deal is mythology. And people, of course, always try to create their own mythologies. So the question is, what piece of that story is accurate or not? It's clear they met. We know they met in a casual sort of way at Batista's finca, at his farm. But what exactly transpired in that is not clear. We have, an account from Rafael Diaz-Balart, who recently died, telling us that the meeting occurred. And there may be a couple of other writings about that. So that'll be one of my tasks as I move forward, is always to dissect mythology from history, because what happened and then what someone wants to say happened later for different motives, are two different things. It's like, we discussed, I know you're interviewing Anthony De Palma for this documentary, yeah. And he makes a very good point here. Herbert Matthews, when he goes to interview Castro in the Sierra Maestra, writes down that he sees a certain number of soldiers with Castro. And then Castro at some luncheon at some point said that he had tricked Matthews by having the same men march around him. Well, that's sort of a funny little story that Castro can use to play up how astute and intelligent he is. The question is it true? And is it a bit of mythology used to raise up his image, or is it fact? And so in terms of that meeting with Batista, same thing. We have to dissect the history from the mythology and see what it is we know happened and what it is that we can only speculate on.
Race and class. Was Batista the victim or target of abuse, verbal or any otherwise, because of his race and his class? And if so, can you give me a couple of examples?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most things that stirred me and interested me while I was doing the Batista biography, is that, his friends, and his son told me this story, his oldest son, Ruben Batista, had told me that his friends always referred to him as El Indio, and his enemies always called him El Negro. And El Indio, of course, refers to the Taíno Indians long gone, of course, by the 20th century, and they conjure up romantic images of innocence, and it's not a politically loaded affiliation, you know. If it's a romantic, nice sort of thing. Ah, el indio, here's el indio. His enemies always referred to him as el negro, you know, kind of referring to the slave period and, you know, the negative stereotypes about Afro-Cubans that have always been prevalent in Cuba. And also, one thing that you notice, and if you looked at some of the cartoons I have in the biography, you'll see that when Batista is depicted by people who don't like him, they always have these exaggerated Afro-Cuban features that they give him. When someone wants to deride him and hurt him, they typically depict him in these exaggerated ways, you know, as Afro-Cuban, and the exaggerated lips, the nose, etc., more along those lines. Yes, in terms of discrimination against him personally, there's an enormous amount of resentment towards him and his racial and ethnic background. There's a famous incident right at the end of 1933. I think it's New Year's Eve, 1933. Batista and his military high command, they're dining at a famous nightclub just outside of Havana called San Sushi. And they walk in there, their wives and the military men. And after a few moments, the crowd, mostly well-to-do European Cubans, realize that they're there. And one by one, they all stand up and leave the premises. So you had things like that throughout Batista's career. An incredibility in the sense that people cannot believe that we have this, as he was called, this mulatto from eastern Cuba running the country. It's hard for many people to accept. Sometimes certain clubs won't invite him to give a presentation because of his racial or ethnic background.
I'm struck in reading your book struck and a little embarrassed being born in Cuba myself, at how violent Cubans are and have been, and when I'm reading the history. I mean, I was reading about those riots and that they dug up the body according to, and that they're, it's reminded me of Al-Qaeda, is what I was thinking. I mean, is this much violence is prevalent throughout this whole time, prelude to Batista, throughout Batista, post-Batista? Why so much violence? I mean, and not just like fistfights, we're talking about like the worst kind of violence.
Well, I think this is at the core of understanding Cuban society. I always tell my students the heroes of Cuba are inevitably martyrs, people who've died in combat. It's a very blood-drenched history, and it has to do really going right back into the 19th century with the very brutal wars for independence. And you end up having, it's almost unbelievable demographically, you end up having a demographic decline in the population because of the mass starvation caused by the tactics employed by the Spanish, and then, the large numbers of Cubans who die in battle and so forth. So what ends up happening is you have a culture steeped in revolution. The martyrs that are created by one generation need to be avenged by the next generation. And so the Cuban struggle to create, to find their own sovereignty has always been a very brutal one. The wars against the Spanish were brutal. And as a result, because of all this bloodshed, you have an idealistic strain that's in the Cuban political culture that you don't find in the United States or in other political cultures. This sense that, in a way, the only way to cleanse the blood of the martyrs is to create a totally new society. So again, the revolution of 1959 is very much in that Cuban tradition of taking the old political system, shattering it, destroying it, and creating something new. Okay? And so in the same way that we in the United States always talk about having a democratic society, and that's what we're, and our mythological heroes, or our historical heroes, I should say, are Washington and Jefferson. These are mostly statesmen. Washington, of course, was a military leader, but he's mostly known for his presidency and as being a statesman. Those are our, founding fathers, if you will. Those are our pantheon of heroes. But look at the Cuban pantheon of heroes. Ignacio Agramonte, Jose Marti, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. And then if you were to go into the 20th century, Antonio Guterres, Frank País, Jose Antonio Echeverria. These people all die violently in combat, trying to create a new revolution, trying to create a new society. All right, and so that strain, if you don't understand that about Cuban history, you don't understand Cuban history. It's very different, and so that's the first thing you need to understand. That's what I tell my students. It's a revolutionary society. Its political culture is geared towards creating something very different and new and changing the old. And so it's steeped in utopian, idealistic thoughts and concepts.
I mean, is there a character flaw handed down from Spain or something? Because I know that sometimes my mom, when she was alive, she used to say, "Los isleños esto."
Well, I would.
We're most of our family's from the Canary Islands. I mean, is that where that comes
Well, I would never think of something like that as being a genetic issue, where political violence is handed down because of genetic traits or anything. I think, it's an issue of environment. It's an issue of the political culture in certain places is very different than in others. And the goal of a historian and a scholar is to determine why those differences are there. So I wouldn't link it to the Spanish in a direct sort of way, other than the fact that they tried to keep the Cubans from becoming independent. It became a very important part of the Spanish economy, and they went to brutal measures. They took brutal measures against the Cubans to try to keep them their last major colony. So in that sense, there's a relationship to the Spanish, but not in a genetic sense.
Okay, and my last question is, communist influence throughout the first half of the 20th century in Cuba. I was struck when I was looking at some videos, some old archival footage down at the National Archives, and I'm seeing something, I think it was from either the 20s or the 30s, and they're saying it's a communist rally. And I'm thinking, man, this cancer has been, deep in there before it fully surfaced. Is that your experience? Were they always working, below the surface? Or was it just really a party with no power until Castro came in?
Well, the thing is, you have to understand, if it's a North American source, they see communism everywhere. Anybody who is against the United States and opposes what the United States wants in the hemisphere is communist. That is almost a reflexive response. That's what they'll always say. So the archival information, indicates that the Communist Party is a pretty small and relatively modest party throughout most of the 20th century. And they have a tradition for being actually on the wrong side of Cuban history. They had backed Machado during the 1920s and 1930s. Machado had made a deal with them to have them organize the labor movement, so they're on the wrong end of that. They're a modest party. They have a cadre of dedicated officials. At some point, they make an alliance with Batista. Batista allows them to function in a more open way. He allows them to organize the labor unions. And so they gain, actually, ironically, more influence under him. And the other thing that's interesting about them is that they're a party with a lot of middle-class intellectuals that are at the core of that party throughout the 40s and 50s. You have Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, for example, Blas Roca. These are very dapper dressers, and they're very much involved with the politics of the day, and they'll negotiate deals with anyone. That's why they negotiate a deal with Batista. It's not that Batista's a communist. They negotiate a deal with him because it'll give them some perks within the government. It'll give them an ability to organize more freely. And as you probably know, they don't even back Castro for most of the Cuban Revolution, the period prior to taking power. It's only, it's not until the middle of 1958 that they really start saying, hey, Batista's ship is sinking, we need to get on Castro's ship. But it's, they're by no means enthusiastic backers of the Cuban Revolution.
I think that guy Escalante was his name, finally went up to
I think Carlos Rafael Rodriguez is one of the earliest backers of Castro, and I think that's in the spring of '58 that he goes, and then he starts trying to shift the party towards supporting Castro.
Although there's no doubt of course, that Raúl and Che Guevara were, of course, pushing in that direction.
Right, they had obviously clear sympathies in that direction. But the official party, the Cuban Communist Party of Cuba, had almost nothing to do with Castro. In fact, Castro was a member of the Ortodoxo Party. Well, I think the one thing, here's what I would say, and here's, I think, the strongest tie-in terms of your work on the Escambray. It's this. The fact that there's been no scholarly biography of Batista up until this time is pretty shocking, pretty amazing, I think, when you think about it, that in 2006 is when we first get this, when I first did this biography, it comes out. And I started to realize as I was doing my work why that is. And that's because Batista is a character that there's a lot of vested interest in keeping the interpretation of who he is and what he is the way it is. And so it's in nobody's best interest in Cuba, certainly, to do a biography of Batista and look at his career, because the revolution sits on a bedrock of a certain historical interpretation, which debases the period prior to the revolution. So the more corrupt, the more debased Batista and anything is before it, the more glorious is the triumph of the revolution. And then in the United States, you have the Cuban exile community that if you start looking at anything that helps justify or explain the revolution, you're immediately labeled as a communist. And therefore, any interpretation of the period from Cuban Americans here is a difficult issue, a challenge. And then scholars in the North American mainstream, they're more fascinated with the Cuban Revolution and have dedicated their interest there. How that ties into Escambray is the following. There's no interest, although Jose Antonio Echeverria is in the pantheon of heroes in Cuba, but he dies, of course, in 1957 during the attempt to storm the palace. All right, so he's safely dead for the revolution. And as you drive around Cuba, you'll see his portrait up in many areas. All right, so he's still acceptable. But those who went to the Escambray, of course, are clearly not, because they'll end up fighting against Castro in the 60s. So it's not in the interests of the revolution to bring up the Escambray. And so to the extent they're mentioned at all, they're mentioned as bandits. All right, and so there's no effort within Cuba to sort of tell that history, that piece of the history, because it doesn't further the revolution's interpretation of history, which is the bedrock upon which the revolution sits. So I think that's the reason why there's been so little done on the Escambray.